we want to bring that to you guys. We want to make sure that you're abreast. I shouldn't use the phrase abreast, right? Like that's not really popular.
I don't even think it's the right use of the word. You can use abreast if you'd like.
All right, guys, awesome news. We are now doing a new segment for you. It's going to be bi-weekly education news. As you know, there's a ton of changes with the SAT, ACT, and college process, and we felt it necessary to keep you guys in the loop on all of those changes. That said, I'm with my associate Jacob, who is behind the camera filming today, and he is going to be giving us the news articles, and we're going to react to them and talk about them and discuss them. So, also, Jacob, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit?
Hey, I'm Jacob.
All right.
Behind the camera.
Very good.
The first piece that we are going to review today was an opinion piece in the New York Times. It reviews the history of grading and suggests other possible long-term alternatives than the pass-fail system that we saw adopted after the coronavirus pandemic forced schools to close. So for you, what do you think about the pass-fail grading system, especially with regards to college? And do you have any broader thoughts about grading as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, that has been an issue in the past few months. Many of the students out there watching this, you may have had pass-fail, you may not have. Some students I know did have grades. And I think that's actually part of the problem is that, some students will have a pass-fail situation and others won't. And that kind of makes it kind of unequal, right? That seems not fair. Like if your school just doesn't provide grades for you for the semester and someone else's school does, you might feel that that person has a leg up on you because you just don't have grades. So I think the point of that article, which we're discussing, was really to suggest some level of uniformity. And I think that's one of the problems in today's day with grades, as all of you probably know, is that it's hard to judge a 95 in one school versus a 95 in another school. And it gets even more difficult when you're talking about pass versus pass, right? That's such a vague term. I think the article was actually suggesting getting rid of grades, if I was correct. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think that would just artificially even things out, and high achieving students would have kind of no reward for that. But I think I understand the argument of the article is that if this was a reward system generated 100 years ago and may not really fit with today's society. So I think at the end of the day, I actually probably would have to say I disagree with that article's approach. Is there a different possible grading system that could be better? Yeah, sure. I don't know if anyone has one yet, though. I don't think pass-fail really benefits students. Maybe, of course, during a crisis, that I think it's totally fine. But I think going forward to continue with pass-fail would be extremely disappointing for a lot of students that put in a lot of time.
And from a college admission standpoint, how do you think the pass-fail system will impact the now rising seniors when they apply to college?
That's another great question. I think because there's been so much of it recently that it won't really impact anyone very much. I think if it continues, though, schools that do only have pass-fail, even if colleges say they will not judge that negatively, I think just having more grade separation and just more detail is always good. I wouldn't want it, but given the circumstances, colleges will not be holding pass-fail against anybody. It just wouldn't be possible to hold that against someone. It's not their decision. But that is actually another point, because some schools are giving students the decision if they want to be pass-fail or they want to take grades. I would probably try to take the grades if I thought my grades were going to be good.
How would you advise a student who was given that option? You said yourself would take the grades, but how would you approach a student who said, hey, Nick, I'm really struggling to choose what will be better for me?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if you really want to think about it that way, if you thought the grades would be at the level you've already been achieving or above, then you would take the grades. And if you thought they were going to be worse, you probably would want to take pass rather than grades. And maybe in one of the other articles we're going to discuss, but that was one of the criteria given out by colleges, was that that what they're looking for out of students nowadays is what can students provide for us education-wise, even though the opportunities are limited, what can you show? And I think if you took the choice to have grades, that shows a commitment to trying to do well under the circumstances. So I think that's a valid point.
This article calls grade inflation an epidemic, particularly at elite schools. What's your experience with grade inflation? How do you feel it's been taken by the American grading system?
I think that is very accurate. Statistically speaking, I know Jacob and I, we discussed this for other things that we're doing. It is real. Statistically speaking, the average high school GPA grade, letter grade, I guess you could say, went from like a B to an A minus in the past 15, 20 years. So yeah, it's totally real, and it does affect a lot of students. I don't want to get into specifics. I do know policies of schools that they have been implementing recently that have just kind of, I guess, added numbers to students' grades. I don't know who that really helps. So I think it just comes from the 8th place trophy society we're in right now. Like, everyone has to be good at everything, and that, like, I suck at a lot of stuff. I'm very bad at many things, and that's fine. Like, you're allowed to be bad at stuff. I don't deserve a trophy for basketball. I'm terrible at it. And I think that's what grades are now. They're just like, well, we can't give someone a B minus or a C because that's a societally unacceptable grade at this point in time. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, like, if you're a B student, that doesn't mean you're a bad student. Like, I'm sure a lot of extremely successful people were B students or lower. How many like famous CEOs didn't even pass college?
Yeah. Okay. Totally engaging with that. A lot of students see 80s, 85s, low 90s as sort of like really bad marks. Like they really feel terrible when they receive those marks. As we sort of come into schooling post-pandemic and focus more holistically on students and their emotional, social, interpersonal needs, how do you think schools can decrease the pressure behind grading?
Yeah, I think by making it less of a status thing and more about achievement. Like, it's just about what you know. It's not about being better than someone else. And that's hard to separate, right? Because it's just inherent in society. It's like, everyone is measuring themselves against each other. And I think, part of the problem, in the advent of social media and like how quickly information can be shared is that like it does make students feel bad when they see other students getting high marks. And I think deflating grades would probably help everybody, because there's and I see it all the time. Students that come to me like, you know what, I have a 99 average in school, and I take a diagnostic ACT and get a 14, and they're just like, how does that make any sense? And I can't even make sense of that. I know those two don't go together totally, but it kind of flies in the face of logic if you don't know basic math that you would have a 99 average in math, So it creates a problematic issue for students. They get a false sense of how good they are at something, And that's the problem with 8th place trophies. Is like, it makes you think that you don't have to improve. There's nothing wrong with being bad at something. It just means you have to either do better or try something else. Like, that's what I do, I don't take it personally when I fail at something. It's an opportunity to improve or move on to something else,
So the second article we're going to review this week is a piece published in the New York Times on June the 10th. It talks about how in the shift to remote learning, students have seen a lot of educational regression, i.e. they've not covered their full curriculum, and some of them have gone back in time. As someone who works in education, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, my general perception of what's gone on is that actually is unfortunately true. It is very hard to progress with 30 kids in an online classroom. I think it's just a difficult situation, and I don't really blame schools because they weren't prepared for this, and I guess they didn't really think they needed to be. But I think we need to get caught up very quickly as a society and either figure out a way to have some kind of school that functions better for students, or really drastically improve online classroom learning, which I'm not sure that that's really possible at this time, or possible to do quickly enough to make that effective. But what I would say is, yes, especially in categories like math and science that take, repetitive explanation and like a lot of descriptive, learning where someone's walking you through steps and like you might not get it and like the person next to you might, and then we all kind of come together to help the person that doesn't get it. That's what really suffers with these online classes. Like, can I present to you a history lesson? Can you take notes? And then can you go home and memorize those? Yeah, I think that actually would be fine. But something a little bit more hands-on, like algebra or fractions first, or reading, like teaching someone how to read, It's just really hard to do over a computer. So I think there's just some inherent difficulties in online learning, especially for younger students. And I think they need to either be overcome or we need to just figure out how to do school in person. That's catastrophic, it really is.
You know, you've done some online teaching. What has worked for you with keeping students engaged?
Well, I think I'm lucky that our class sizes are either one or very, very small. So I think that's one thing to keep the students engaged would be to keep the class sizes down. But that's really not possible in a public setting to like just change the class size. Like you just have so many kids, you just have to deal with them. I think using interactive quizzes and really just trying to make it interactive. That's what school is, right? It's a social atmosphere. Like you're there together, you're learning, you have some time to chat with each other, you have some time to interact and talk about personal stuff, and in between classes you can do X, Y, and Z with your friends, and like you're in the hallway together. Like there's just so many little moments of personal interaction and like where you don't even realize that learning is probably going on or like helping. Whereas if you're in online school, there's no hallway, right? There's no lunchroom, there's no playground. So all of the socialization and like the extra help that goes on in those environments, like study hall, homeroom, like where students are helping each other learn things and talking about their work and keeping up on it, those are all gone, and you'd be surprised what the value of those are. So and maybe that's an idea, to add in some kind of like socialization time where students can interact with each other. Because I think that's the other huge problem that's affecting their learning in online school, is that they're just there in a classroom. There's not a lot of interaction between the students. They can't really talk to each other that much. And then they're gone. So it's just lectures. It's like being in college. And lectures don't really work for 8-year-olds.
We would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the socioeconomic and racial disparities that exist in this regression. For instance, a study by McKinsey and Company found that Black and Hispanic students could experience greater learning losses than white students, around 10 to 9 months compared to 7 months for higher income and white students. I don't even know how to begin addressing this. How does that make you feel as someone who works in education?
Yeah, I mean, it's just terrible. I mean, it's actually very disheartening, honestly. I think the main thing would be, and you know, what is that attributed to? My guess would probably be technology and just access to the things you need. Like if I was, you know, and you know, working with some of the students, like they're set up with a laptop and an iPad at the same time. You know, like the laptop is streaming the class and the iPad has the notes, and like that's a lot of technology to have for one person to do this effectively. It's like having a backpack full of notebooks, so to speak, you know? So I think that's probably the main problem, is that like if you have one computer for a household of 5 people and 4 of them are in school, it's pretty much impossible for them to all do school. It's just not possible. Technology seems to be the main issue, you know? It seems like nothing other than that.
Yeah. And how are you and Curve Breakers attempting to bridge those gaps and really address those disparities?
Well, I mean, what we did was with our own programs is try to, create some more affordable options. So we created a book that's under $30. We're working on a course that's going to be under $100. So I think just creating more accessible options, I think, would be good. I mean, the real answer for schools would be to provide technology for everybody, but obviously that would be an immense cost. And you also have problems like internet and connectivity issues and blah, blah, blah. But, what we've done is try to provide a vast array of new online stuff so that people can prep more cheaply and more affordably, you know.
Not really an article, but the American Association of Pediatricians recently released a statement that encouraged schools to invite students back in the fall. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a great one. It's funny you mentioned that. I actually did a TikTok video on that one, and I asked people to respond in the comments what they thought. You know, did you think this is a good idea? Do you think this is crazy? Students definitely were very mixed. I thought honestly that they were gonna be like, I can't wait to go back. Like I really have to do that. And some of them were very hesitant, I would say. And one of the things, we're in New York, so I don't know how many students were in your old high school, like
130 per grade. So
yeah,
500.
So 500, and my high school was probably about 1,000 maybe. These students have like 4,000 kids in their school. Some of them are even saying their school is separated into 2 different buildings, and because it's so large, and that there's like crossing between the 2 buildings. So like, I think there was like a lot of concern just based on the size. I think of like smaller size schools around here, maybe there's like more of a control that you can put on things and make it safer. But I do agree with the study that it is extremely important that we do get some kind of school back, because if we don't, students are losing the socialization, I think, is the biggest issue. But I do understand why some students are very hesitant about that. And I think the other thing is they're all also thinking about all their extracurricular activities. So not just entering school, but what about clubs? What about music? What about, sports? Obviously sports involve contact. Music involves blowing spit into instruments and having it fly out the other side. I mean, those kind of things seem kind of difficult to pull off. And I think they're concerned about how those are going to happen. Not only just classroom, but that as well. So I do agree with the study, but I think students are not that on board with it.
How do you think, because we can both agree that returning to schools and getting a good education is an absolute priority, it should be a priority. How do you feel schools can sort of mediate that anxiety about returning and make sure they have a safe environment? Or do you even think it's possible?
I think it is possible. I think, we have to just be diligent. People have to wear masks. They have to temperature check themselves. If you feel sick, stay home. Like it has to just be, we have to get past the American culture of like going to work sick. Like that's like a very American thing to do, like just plow through it, like show up to school with a fever, like that just has to end. And I think some amount of online learning at some point in time may be necessary, but maybe things like barriers could be helpful, reducing the amount of students in the classroom at one time. I've heard a lot of ideas about that, like splitting school into different segments, like A segment, B segment, that go at different times. It's probably gonna have to be modified is really the answer, but that's probably the best I can think of. I mean, I'm not in that kind of planning. So hopefully they're coming up with some ideas that we haven't even thought about, and that would be great, I hope.
So we talked about school reopening, but college reopening is on a lot of people's minds. Last piece we're going to review was again from the New York Times, and it talked about college towns and how they're experiencing substantial economic loss because the students aren't there, and the students make up such a large portion of their community. Why don't you tell us about your college town?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that while you're saying that, and that was the first time I thought about it, because we reviewed these stories before we did this, and I was just thinking, it's funny because there was like a local deli in my right outside of my college that a lot of people went to, and you could tell they were really struggling. And one of my friends became friends with the family there, and it's not easy. These towns are not really very built up economically. Besides this, what comes from the students. There were some statistics cited in that article that you pulled up, Jacob, which were like 70% of the people in some of these college towns are students at some point in time, or they're contributing $100 million to the economy of that area. I mean, it's tough. I mean, for whatever reason, it's probably because the land is cheaper. Colleges put their, they buy land in kind of rural areas or, less expensive, lower income areas, so they can buy up the land and build up their college. And the byproduct of that is that the local community is, a little bit economically struggling sometimes, and that's unfortunate. And I think this will put a lot of those businesses under, because if half of the college students are there, the bars and the restaurants and the shops and the local places just may not be able to make it, and that's very, very unfortunate, because then those will close, and then when the students go back and things turn around, there's just not going to be anything there. The laundromats, the takeout restaurants, like all the stuff that you need for college, little coffee shops and studies. It just may not be able to last, and that's sad, because it worsens the college experience and then kind of brings down the whole system. It's part of the college experience.
How concerned are you that many colleges that are right now just struggling to stay afloat will close if we don't return in the fall?
That was something that I also read about. That's a great point. Someone predicted that like 200 to 300 colleges are probably going to close, mostly small liberal arts colleges. That's partially due to the economics and partially due to the fact that those colleges are typically very expensive and they produce lesser income at the end of college, as opposed to, going into nursing, right? Like, because you're just going to get a good job going into nursing. You might not necessarily get a high-paying job majoring in English right off the bat. So those colleges are perceived as less valuable, and they just are struggling. So that is a concern. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's probably bad, but the whole college process might be a little bit bloated, we could call it right now. There's too many colleges, there's too many students paying too much for college. There's too much loaning going on in terms of students taking out massive loans to go to colleges that are just not necessary for them to go to. And that's a bubble. It's bloat. It's just not good economically. So this may be like a little bit of a reset on the college process, so to speak, on the entrance process with tests and the essays and how it's all perceived and what goes on and the competitiveness. It may be a moderate, slight reset of the process, and then it'll probably end up getting worse in the years after that, because that's always how it works, right? One step back, two steps forward. So, all right, Jacob, since most of that news was extremely negative, why don't you give me something positive? Let's hear it.
Why don't you talk about Malala and her graduation from Oxford?
Great. That's perfect. So if everyone remembers, Malala is like an advocate for women's education. She was actually, very unfortunately, I think, shot by the Taliban, if I remember correctly, several years ago and survived. And she is now an advocate, for equality in women's education, and that's awesome. She actually just graduated from Oxford with some incredibly complicated degree. What's her degree?
And her degree was in philosophy, politics, and economics.
Great for her. If I remember correctly, she's planned on taking some time off and relaxing, probably very deserved. I'm sure she needs some time off. Being an advocate and also being shot and then doing all this is just a lot. So hats off to her. All the power to her. Hopefully she continues on to do great things. So that's the positive news. The rest of it was pretty negative, but we appreciate you guys tuning into our news segment. We're going to be doing this every other week now, talking about the news, and we're also going to be doing the Q&A. If you like the content, subscribe to the channel. You want to stay abreast on the college process and what's going on. We're going to keep you guys posted on everything. So hit that subscribe, hit that bell, and I'll catch you guys soon. Peace.